thesis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you haven't done so, please click subscribe so you automatically, seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? And now, today's show.
I was just saying to Ken Accardi that we've angered the tech gods in a previous life. This is our second attempt at this podcast. Ken, I really appreciate your flexibility, your willingness to hop back on and have this conversation. You are a CEO. You are a technologist. You are a professor at Babson. You have so much going on. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think not only last time did we talk about Agile, which I'd like to get back to, but we kind of went into some other nooks and crannies around this topic of leadership, which was a lot of fun. So, Ken, why don't you tell our guests a little bit about you?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you for welcoming me back to the podcast. I hope we work out well today and that we haven't overly angered the internet technology gods. But yeah, I run a software company called Ancoda, and we make software actually for elderly care. The easiest way to explain it is keeping our grandparents out of the nursing home so they could stay in their own home and get some care. And
that's a great mission, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's a great, it's you get to do well by doing good. And that's a wonderful thing. And I do teach at Babson College just as an adjunct professor. I teach information technology. I have degrees in engineering, which was focused on computer engineering, and a master's in computer science and an MBA. So I'm not a leadership educator, but I do lead a company, and I thought I might be able to share some practical wisdom, and it seems like this is the right place.
Well, I love that because we have a lot of scholars as guests, and the scholars are wonderful. I mean, I think my perspective on this whole topic is looking at it from so many different angles and bringing people's different experiences and voices into this tent, I think is a wonderful thing. So the fact that you have a foot in academia and a foot in actual practice leading the company, I think is an invaluable perspective. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about you. How did you get into technology? How did you get into founding your company? What was that path?
Well, I grew up in my career at GE, and having graduated from college with an engineering degree, and I would say that I was sort of in the technical track of the company, and I was growing as a technology leader and things like that. I went from GE, which at the time was a $150 billion company, to a small Israeli consulting company that wanted to put an office in Boston. So it was a very big jump from huge company to small company. And what I did see jumping into this small startup entrepreneurial world is that the quality of the leadership wasn't quite as strong as what I had experienced with Jack Welch at the time when I was with GE toward the end of the 1990s. And I then really said, hey, I noticed that the people with the C's in their titles, the CTOs and the COOs and the CEOs, that they had a business degree. And I didn't really understand business. So that compelled me to go, after having an undergraduate technical degree and a master's in computer science, to go back and get an MBA at Babson, where I teach, which is actually a school focused on entrepreneurship.
It's number one in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it is really a very awesome place for trying to teach people how to start businesses and take over family businesses. And yeah, so it's really fun. And I drank the Kool-Aid. And and then I finally got the confidence to say, hey, I think I could maybe make a run at this on my own. And that's how I transformed from being a techie guy to CEO of a tech company.
Tell me about, again, great mission, incredible mission. I'm sure there's really fascinating statistics about elderly actually being able to be home versus being in a facility? Is there interesting research and data on those statistics?
I'd say there's a great deal of data on quality of life. And I've read a lot of articles that say that elderly people have greater fear of being in institutional care, like a nursing home, than in a lot of cases than they do of dying, which kind of speaks volumes. So yeah, the kind of home care that we support, we're not a home care company. We provide the software to run a home care company, is the ongoing kind that helps to keep the elderly and the disabled living in their homes. So caregivers come and they help them with what we call activities of daily living. So they're helping them with dressing, grooming, hygiene, nutrition, and things like that. And it is a great industry that really increases quality of life. And actually, it's also a pretty well socially isolated sort of way of doing things. So as COVID first broke, the nursing homes were places where people were really hard hit. And in general, in home care, there's maybe a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio between caregivers and the people who are receiving the care. So it is pretty well socially isolated, and actually the industry has done pretty well despite COVID.
Well, and as you're building the company, I know that you are in a wonderful perspective that you're going to bring to Phronesis is your love of agile management. Would you share a little bit about Agile and why, for you as a leader, as a CEO, it's been transformational? It's been incredibly productive. It's been helpful. What is it about that process and that way of thinking that you found beneficial?
Yeah, a few thoughts. So first of all, when I was in college, the way that they taught project management was all about the waterfall method or the Gantt chart type of an approach where you kind of map out all the steps of your project. And that's all I really knew. And then this idea of working in an agile way came up sort of mid-career for me. And the idea is that instead of trying to plan everything out up front, that what you do is you break the project into small pieces and you say, hey, we want to deliver in my company's case, every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And we make this big list of all the things that we want. And we say, well, which ones do we want the most? And then we go through a process to say, what can we knock out in the next 2 weeks? And we choose to do that. And we have a release every 2 weeks. So it's a very empowering sort of way of doing projects for a lot of reasons. One is that the improvements are coming much more quickly as opposed to waiting for a big release. And since you're only building a little bit at a time, you only have to test a little bit. So you don't have that chance of breaking something when you make a lot of big changes. And also just from a positive perspective, there's a lot of points for celebration. And so every 2 weeks you have something new out and something to be proud of as a team. And you have new little gifts of functionality for your customers. So that's what it's all about. And it's a very simple thing, but it's very, very empowering from my perspective.
Well, and you said something really important there. You have something to celebrate. Every couple of weeks, we can celebrate what it is we've accomplished. It's very finite. I love that. And then how often is it that you go in thinking, well, these are going to be the priorities, but then you get 2 weeks later and those priorities have shifted? Does that happen a lot? I imagine it does.
Well, it's kind of, I'd say in a typical 2 week cycle, which we call sprints.
Yep.
We say we're going to release a sprint every few weeks. And if I looked in our system for tracking that now, I have earmarked what will start to be developed. So our next release is January 7th, and the one after that will be January 21st. And I have a reasonable idea of what will be in the January 21st release. But as we're recording this on December the 22nd, I have around 8 or 9 days to make those final decisions. And there's a good chance that I'd say that 2/3 of what's in there now will stay, and that last third will be a little bit variable. And a lot of it could be because, hey, we just closed a new customer in the state of Idaho and they need us to do something special for them, or that type of thing. So it really does give you the ability to have planning, but not a hard and fast plan and to roll with the punches, as you said.
Think of all of the time, I imagine earlier in your career, all of the time that was wasted on rework. Once we spent months working on something, getting it to the customer, rolling it out, and then understanding that maybe that wasn't what they wanted, it didn't have the functionalities. Is that one part of this as well?
That's a very, very big part, is to try to avoid rework. And also, where I thought you were going to go is that we used to spend lots and lots of time planning. I mean, we'd spend months or weeks, and just saying, well, we think this is 4 hours of work and this is 12 hours of work. And we'd make these huge plans and spend a lot of time on that. And really, in the Agile world, you spend a lot less time on making a detailed plan, and the actual planning process is much easier, because when somebody comes up with an idea, say, hey, we should have this in our code, we put it on the list, and that takes just a short amount of time. And then when we meet every 2 weeks in the middle of the sprint, we say, okay, what's important for us to come next? Well, maybe that one idea doesn't make it for 3 or 4 sprints, but somebody remembers it. And sometimes even somebody brings up an idea and it never comes back. And we do something every once in a while and we say, hey, that was an interesting idea, but we did it a different way, or maybe we don't really need that. And that's a great thing that doesn't happen in the traditional planning approach, because when you do try to plan, let's say 6 months of work all on day one, it's really impossible to know all the things that you need. And it's very likely that you've thought of things that you could live without. And so having this Agile methodology lets you solve all those problems.
Well, and I think I mentioned to you in our last conversation that a colleague, actually a friend of mine from high school, we're actually in the process of starting a company, and he's been leading me through somewhat of a similar process. We get together every Friday and we talk about our list, and sometimes things will get shifted, sometimes things will get reprioritized, and then that's the next batch that we're going to work on. And then that goes up to a server that only Justin can see, and he's playing around with it, and then it's released. But I didn't realize I was going through this process myself.
Yeah, you were part of an Agile development process and you didn't even realize it, because it's really becoming the way that people do their projects and develop. And it started, I'd say, mostly in software. There were a couple of guys who got together, guys and women, and they wrote this thing called the Agile Manifesto.
Yeah.
And they said, hey, these are some things that are important to us. And of course, Agile is a verb, but where I guess, I'd say Agile, is an adjective. And now it's become a noun. So, well, people do Agile, or they have, an Agile methodology. So that would be putting it back in the context of an adjective. But it really just kind of started that way. And then, of course, as people began to build more specific methodologies around this, they turned it into a noun and made it something that you could train on and teach on and things like that. But just to go on a little tangent, when people say, hey, I learned so much in college about, how to do my craft, how to write software or how to do marketing, but I never really learned much about how teams collaborate.
Yeah.
And things like that. I recommend that you can Google this. There's a video that's called Spotify Culture, so Spotify, the music player.
Yes.
And you can just Google Spotify Culture Part 1. It's around a 12-minute video. And it actually was put out as a recruiting video by Spotify when they were in a really big growth phase, to talk about their Agile culture and really try to lure developers to come to them and say, hey, look at this. We work in these small teams and we're empowered to drive our own schedules and prioritize what comes out. And they've come up with some clever ways of making the various parts of the music player work independently of one another. And it really, I think, speaks to the hearts and minds of people who have been stuck in these big old school waterfall projects. And also the reason I recommend it a lot is that as an undergraduate, you probably don't get enough learning on how things really go in the workplace. And this puts it in perspective. So I say, hey, go watch that video, and whatever terminology you hear that you don't know, go Google that terminology and look up those words, and then go watch it again. And then when you go in that interview and they start talking about, well, we're going to have you work on a team, and you're going to deliver these sprints every 2 weeks. And this team is, if you're on support, it's going to be more of a Kanban model, and these guys are going to follow something called the Scrum methodology. Then you'll have heard of those various different pieces. And but all in all, it gives you an idea on how people collaborate in the workplace, and it's really, really important as somebody entering the workplace to have that perspective.
Well, and I love that practical tip. And so, as a CEO, I know you've listened to some episodes of Phronesis. I know that. I'm going to ask this two ways. What do you think maybe have we not? I mean, I love this whole Agile, bringing that piece of it into the conversation. Are there other pieces of the conversation that you think haven't been introduced yet? Anything missing as someone who's doing the work day in, day out? We could also frame that as lessons. What have you learned along the way that Agile being one of them? Are there other tools, ways of thinking, resources that just really help guide your way as you're building the company?
Well, you've asked a lot of things in that question, and I have a lot of thoughts here. But the very first episode of Phronesis was sort of built around the concept of, Houston, we have a problem, and it was, hey, we've put these people through this awesome leadership education, and then we've kind of measured the results, and we haven't really seen so many of the results that we hoped, and that's what we're trying to do with this podcast and with so many other things. And I remember specifically listening to one of the podcasts with Dr. Diane Dixon.
Yeah.
And in that, it actually wasn't brought up by Dr. Dixon, but by you, was that there's a methodology which says, it's called the 70-20-10 rule, which says that, kind of 10% comes from the classroom, 20% comes from relationship building, and the other remaining 70% really comes from doing. And so I kind of said, well, I'm not a leadership educator, but maybe I have something to contribute. and then, one of the, sometimes I think you guys really do try to be practical, but sometimes you do get into the academic side. And one person, just because they've been in so much research, was a Dr. Ron Riggio. And he's, you really covered a lot of topics, and hey, what's the latest thinking in this area of leadership education and so on and so forth. But one thing that he said was, well, we study the leaders a lot, but we don't really study the followers a lot. And that's something we need to do more. And I guess that kind of struck me as a little bit, I've never worked with anybody who said, well, I'm a follower in my company. I don't really feel like I'm, somebody who is a follower. I think everybody is, maybe a team member bringing their own things. And I think that the great thing about Agile is it really empowers all the people to, let's say, be on the same level, because you want to get this release out in 2 weeks, and there's people who are going to write code. There's people who are going to make sure that the user interface and user experience are to the customer's expectation. There's people who are going to test the code. And you really want them all working together, sort of like, a jazz group. They just all seem to just be jiving together, and everybody's contributing and doing their part. And in the end, you get something, really beautiful out of it. And so you really want everybody practicing at the best of their ability, as opposed to, sort of being hierarchically, told what to do and that sort of thing. And this really empowers. And I guess, we've talked a lot in the context of software development and things like that. But another way this has changed me personally is that I remember as a young manager, or maybe as a young employee and being managed, there was a lot of questions of, well, what's your plan? How are you going to get this? How are you going to get this done? And I remember that being a hard question early in my career, when I hadn't maybe even done those pieces of the equation or the puzzle before. And so what I ask people now is, I say, well, what are the first couple of things that you think you might want to, do to make some progress? And I always listen for what is 80% of the time the right answer. It's like, well, if I could build the login screen first, and then I could get them to test that out, and then I could make sure that the fingerprint login and the Face ID is working, that would be a great next step, and that sort of thing. That's what I want to hear. What I don't want to hear is them to say, well, I think I should sit down and do some planning, and then I should do some, kind of design, and then I should do some thinking about it. It's like, I know you're going to do all those things, but what I really want is you to break it down into what are the pieces of work that you could show to somebody? You could say, hey, mom, look what I developed, and have those be done. And if people could break those into that, and they could come up with a list of, let's say, 10 things that need to be done on that project, say, well, great, now that you've broken the project into 10 things, you've probably covered all of it or maybe most of it. Which 2 or 3 or 4 things do you think you should try to knock out between now and when we meet next week? And so right there, even on an individual level, you're teaching people to be, agile among themselves, and just kind of break the work down into smaller pieces. Or there's the expression, eat the elephant one bite at a time.
Yep.
And that's what you're doing. And you can do it on an individual level as well as on a team level.
It's an interesting conversation, Ken, and let's go there for a moment. So, yes, I was surprised when Ron said, I think the quote was, of course, leaders don't do leadership. Leadership is co-created with followers. So that was kind of an interesting statement. I'd never heard it framed that way. And then I had a conversation with Sharna Fabiano, who comes out of the world of Tango, where in that episode was called Connect, Collaborate, Create. And the way she thinks about it is that, you have to have each player in the tango has to have a very clear understanding of their roles, very clear. And if we are really clear on that, then we can collaborate with one another and we can do the work. But we have to be really, each of us, skilled at our part. And then she gets to the point where really the couple moves into a state of flow, and they literally are creating. They're creating new, and they don't even have to think about the mechanics any longer. It's just happening. And I had a really fun conversation. I've released way too many episodes in the last 2 weeks. So people I had a little bit of a backlog, Ken. But I had a great conversation with a gentleman named Aldo Boitano. He was on it was in the mid-90s. It was a Chilean team to climb K2. So, of course, a quarter of the people who leave to climb K2 do not return. Very dangerous. They trained for 3 years. They trained with psychologists. They scenario planned every possibility so that when something did happen, they again, similar to a Sharna Fabiano, they knew their role, what to do. And in fact, Aldo had to save someone's life at high altitude, which meant that he didn't summit. But that was the automaticity that they'd gotten to because it just happened. So I think followership, even in this Agile context, and I'm literally just thinking off the top of my head, is that the people's roles are so clear, and then we get so good at communicating and working with one another that in some ways the leader-follower thing falls away. People have their roles, and if we do it well, then we just each have our role. We're going to fulfill that role. We're going to troubleshoot that role, and leader-follower almost doesn't become something that makes sense anymore in the traditional way of thinking about it. How does that statement hit you?
It hits me very well. I am running a pretty small company with 15 people. So we don't need layers of management in the company. And in a lot of perspectives, I'm not the leader, I'm the follower. Hey, I am working on a project where Sharon is the project manager, and she needs to have some software development done. And one of the roles I wear in the company is more the product management side. So I am subcontracted to her to figure out what she needs and to impart that over to Carmen's team who develops the software and things like that. So really, I think that small companies, and we try to be a little bit more like a bigger company, small companies are all relationships and things like that. And then you get into having processes and people understanding their roles in the process. And then it really does jive, and people don't need, if I took 2 weeks off from the company, everything's going to keep going because we have these processes in place. The software is going to be developed, and people are going to step in and make the decisions. And so, yeah, I think that really understanding your role in the team, having the processes in place. This is another conversation for the other day, but having a culture in place. I think that culture trumps everything, right? Yep. And by the way, my definition of culture is what people do when nobody's telling them what to do, right? It's like, the culture of your company is like, okay, well, nobody's here to tell me what to do, but this is the way we do things here.
Yeah.
And so, so I really think that having processes and culture and everybody really feeling empowered to do, their role and play their, if they're in that, let's go back to the jazz band analogy, if they're the bass player, they know what they're supposed to be doing, and the drummer knows what they're supposed to be doing, and they're supposed to be right on the beat. And that allows the soloist to be a little bit behind the beat, and allows the, keyboard player to decide, what upper structures to lay over that standard chord, set of chord changes, and things like that. So people know what their role is, where they have to fill in the music, and where they can use their artistic license, and where they really have to stay in line. And that's, it's all a beautiful thing.
Well, and of course, we're oversimplifying the difficulty that it takes to get to that point. I have a book in my head, an idea for a book, Ken. Maybe we'll write it together someday. But it's called the 3-month rule. And basically it's as a leader, as a CEO, could you leave your organization for 3 months and have it hum along? Because I know a lot of people, especially in your position, we have 15, 30, 45 people, and they feel they're on the hamster wheel. They are just, they have to be there. They have to be doing. And I've said to some of these leaders, do you think you could leave for 2 weeks and have it? Oh, no, 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 I couldn't. Well, are you actually building? Are you building then? Or are you just going to stay on the hamster wheel for decades, right? And so it's an interesting conversation. The 3-month rule, just let that ruminate for a little while.
That sounds good. Yeah, actually, I received an early Christmas gift from one of my employees, and it was a quote. I won't have it perfect.
Yeah.
From Gandhi, but it said, leaders are not measured by the number of people they lead, it's by the number of leaders they create.
Yeah.
And it really, resonated. And that was somebody who, when I was really early in the company, I was doing pretty much all the jobs in the company. I brought this young woman who had an art history major, but some experience in home care, into this company to be a junior project manager, to lead some projects. And now she's the chief operating officer of the company. And she just has these awesome leadership skills. And she actually just completed her certification, the PMP certification. So the project management professional, which covers both, agile and traditional methods of project management, and this type of thing. So I think that I would say that that there have been times in my company started in 2014. There's been times along the way where I really did feel like I couldn't take any time off, and now I do feel like I could take time off. But having said that, I have always shifted to different things. So I don't have to do the implementation and the support leadership anymore, because Sarah's team does most of that. And Carmen's team does most of the software development. And I'm spending more of my time on marketing and the brand, and and product management. So my role changes. But yeah, it is. I think it is really important to empower people and help grow them, and not have to do everything yourself. Otherwise, you limit the potential of your company if you're the bottleneck in a lot of different things.
When we spoke last, you mentioned self-led and self-governed. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the way that Agile works is that there's this, it's really unclear who's the leader in an Agile team. So there is somebody who's called the Scrum Master.
Yeah.
And they lead a daily meeting, which is supposed to be a stand-up meeting and supposed to take 15 minutes or less. And they basically, now of course it's all virtual over Zoom or what have you, but they get the whole team together and they say, hey, we committed to get all of this done in the next 2 weeks. How are we doing? And somebody will say, I ran into a roadblock. I didn't realize that this part didn't work and I have to fix that as well. And somebody will say, well, I actually found that I thought I had to build this whole piece of code that wasn't there, but I actually found I could reuse something else. So why don't I jump onto your task to help you? And that kind of thing. So in a sense, they're facilitating this 15-minute meeting on a daily basis to make sure everybody's on track, and they're escalating and trying to keep the deliverable on track. But it's not like they're leading hierarchically everybody. And then there's this other role called the product owner. And this is somebody who is really taking that backlog of work that wants to get done, and from the customer and the business perspective, prioritizing it and making sure that there's enough understanding of the requirements. And by the way, these days we don't really write requirement specs. We write what we call stories.
Okay.
And we make sure that the stories are well enough understood that the developer can get their task and know what to do. So there, I mean, those two people have played their leadership roles, but nobody's really, sitting in the corner office and, hierarchically leading the team.
Yeah.
And in general, the product owner has a lot of work doing, understanding the requirements and writing the stories and maybe doing some testing. And in my case, my lead developer, actually my chief technology officer, Carmen, will do those leadership roles, and she's in charge of the deployment and things like that. But she also does a great amount of software development herself. So it's really, self-empowered and self-led teams are very, very important. And it's really how things work. And, going on a quick little tangent, if it's okay, I've come to learn recently about something in the Netherlands. What Buurtzorg is they had this idea of, how can we provide healthcare in the community? And they said, well, let's put a team in like each of these little villages. And they started in a couple of villages, and they said, all right, we're going to put either 3 or 4 or 5 nurses together in this village and just let them figure out what are the health needs of the village. Huh. And there's no management. They're just a self-led team, and they go and they find out the needs. And it, long story short, I mean, this is like turned out to be a movement that has grown across the Netherlands and into other countries. And what it's done is it prevents a lot of hospitalizations, and it has, significantly, I mean, measurably in terms of billions of dollars, reduced the cost of healthcare in the Netherlands and things like that. And it really, I mean, the foundation of it, from the guy who started it, his name is Joost de Blok, is really just, hey, it's just all about, taking people who are trained as a nurse and letting them do nursing in a team where it's needed. And that's as simple as the idea is. And by taking out all of this bureaucracy and hierarchy and things like that, they've saved their country billions of dollars per year and resulted in better health outcomes as well.
The Netherlands, I released a podcast today with a gentleman from the Netherlands, and it's a fascinating conversation if you get a chance. But, they are the second largest exporter of food. The Netherlands. How large are, if we compare that to the States, it's the size of Illinois and Ohio combined? I don't know. But the second largest exporter of food in the world. The innovation and I love the Dutch. I love the Dutch. I love it. I love it. The creativity and the innovation and the ingenuity. It's so fun. It's so fun. Well, Ken, I know you are a lover of quotes. So do you have a couple of quotes that come to mind when you think about this topic? And then we'll also discuss a little bit about what resources you found valuable, that you'd like to share with listeners, and anything else that you're consuming that you find incredibly helpful. I know we've got the Freakonomics Radio. We'll put that in the show notes for sure. But how about some quotes that help you frame leadership, and then maybe some resources that stand out for you?
Well, early in my career, I worked in GE under the leadership of Jack Welch. And one thing that he said a lot, I won't say it's a exact quote, but he said that our job as leaders is to provide resources and get out of the way.
Yeah.
So even at somebody who was leading at the time a $150 billion company, he understood that if you could provide resources and let people do their things on their own, that's a really good thing. And then just to put it in the context of Agile. So I know that this is a quote that's been attributed to a number of people, but I think it actually came from Dwight Eisenhower. He said that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So and I guess he was probably taking troops into battle and things like that. So if you have the training and you have the ability to work as teams and you have a general idea of your plan, that's going to be more valuable than saying, okay, well, we're going to go here and we're going to we're gonna cut this off and that sort of thing. So those would be a couple of quotes. And then moving in other directions on podcasts, I really do like Freakonomics. I'd say that one of my little pet peeves, just as an educator, is I think that our high school students are learning the wrong math, right? So I think that, like the things you learn, algebra, trigonometry, calculus, geometry, you don't use those a whole lot in your life these days. And I think I actually heard another podcast about this, but they were put in place by institutions like Harvard and Yale to try to see, well, who has the academic capacity to perform at institutions of higher learning and that type of thing. And I really think that what they should be replaced with is learning more about making decisions with data, because this is where things are. And Freakonomics, it actually started out as a book, and I think there was a sequel. But the idea is, like, let's look at data and figure out how to make decisions from data. So it's really interesting from that perspective, and I love it. Another podcast I love a lot is this one that's called the Moth Radio Hour. And so the Moth is all about storytelling, and the whole, and they actually have these conferences and things like that where people just go and they just tell stories. And so I'd say, as this person who transformed from someone with a technical degree to someone who became a CEO, that storytelling is a really, really important part of things. So those would be a couple of podcasts I'd recommend. Would be Freakonomics and the Moth Radio Hour. And so I guess those are a couple I'll pass your way.
Love it. The president of Northeastern, which is in your neck of the woods, I don't know if he had a book called Robot Proof. I'll also put that in the show notes. Have you seen that book for any reason?
I have not.
So Robot Proof, very interesting book. His perspective on the future of education, and exactly in alignment with really what you just said, that a third of it has to be your traditional liberal arts, and especially the teaming, working together, and communication, that dimension. And then there's the dimension of the data literacy. And then there's the dimension, I believe, of the technologist. And so I think he's very much in alignment with where you're headed. I read somewhere recently that high school students in China are taking courses in artificial intelligence. And that's a very interesting thought. I mean, it just is, because I believe that's probably the future. Scott Galloway, who has an interesting podcast and an interesting weekly newsletter, he wrote a pretty famous, if you haven't looked at this, look up the article USS University. And this was written in the summertime. And basically, he was kind of positing, he's a marketing professor at NYU. He was positing on who was going to survive, which institutions of higher education were going to survive the COVID crisis and come out still intact. And it was interesting because he also has been pretty critical about what we're teaching, how we're teaching. He made a statement that calculus is an $8 billion industry. I'd never thought of it that way. But if you think about these textbooks, and if you think about everything, the complex that's built around the SAT and the ACT and just all of that, wow.
So Northeastern is one of the things that distinguishes that school is it's very much, you go there and you take your classes, but then you go and you co-op.
Yep.
So everybody at Northeastern does co-op experiences. And interestingly, I'm glad that you brought up artificial intelligence in China, because really most of the artificial intelligence we see today is what I call machine learning. And machine learning is really mostly applied statistics. And so when we do things like, you're typing in your Gmail and Google recommends how you finish your sentence and it does a really good job of it.
Yeah.
That's machine learning. And it's there's a lot of data and it does that. Or when even, at a simpler level, when you're on Amazon, you just, bought something for your wife and they recommend something to go with it. That's machine learning. Or when you're on Netflix and they, recommend what you watch next. A lot of this is really just applying statistics into machine learning. And that is if you understand the data and the statistics and how to make decisions from data, that's really where I think most of the jobs in the next, quarter century are going to come from.
Yes. That, right? I mean, that's the future. That's the future. Ken, go eat some cookies. Have some holiday cheer. It's it's midday. Are you off yet for the week, or are, are you still going?
Yeah, still going. We support home care, which is a 365 day of the year business. So we'll be working, and but yeah, taking some nice time on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and pretty slow between Christmas and New Year's.
Thank you for reaching out. Thanks for helping our listeners better understand Agile and some of your perspectives as a practicing CEO doing the work. Always an incredible perspective to, like I said, bring under the tent. So thank you, sir. Be well. And I wish you all the best in 2021.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks again to Ken for making that conversation occur a second time. For me, the practical wisdom in our conversation is all around Agile. It's an area that I need to learn more about. I need to read the Agile manifesto. And so I think for me, it's all about how we get the work done. We have this vision of where we want to go, and it feels a little bit more on the side of management to me. But if we go back to some of the conversation we have, and if you have not listened to the episodes with Sharna Fabiano, Ron Riggio, David Day, Aldo Boitano, I would highly encourage you to do so, because we're knocking on the door of this really fun part of the conversation about leaders and followers. And what do we do to make the work kind of wash away some of those titles so that we are simply a highly cohesive team accomplishing incredible things, each with a clear understanding of their role and that work? I had an opportunity to read a preview of Sharna's upcoming book, Lead and Follow, and it's just wonderful. I'm excited to have her back on the podcast at some point. Speaking of having people back on the podcast, our first episode of 2021 will be with Ron Riggio. He has a new book out called Daily Leadership Development. So be on the lookout for that conversation. Goodbye 2020. Hello 2021. Be well, everybody. Take care. You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.